most recent books are China at War and the Chinese Communist Party, A Century in 10 Lives. Moderating the session will be Professor Madhavi Thampi, who is an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. She was an associate professor at the Department of East Asian Studies in Delhi University, where she taught Chinese history. Today's event will be chaired by Professor Srimati Chakrabarti, Editor, China Report, and Chairperson of the Institute of Chinese Studies. She's also former professor of Chinese Studies at the Department of East Asian Studies at Delhi University. A very warm welcome to all our distinguished panelists. Before handing over to the chair, I'd like to lay down the housekeeping rules. All audience members shall remain muted during the lecture. Questions can be posted in the chat box anytime during the presentation or using the raise hand option during the Q&A session. Please unmute only when called upon by the moderator to do so. Thank you. Over to the chair.
Thank you, Shruti. And good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Hans van der Ven, the speaker today for the VP Dutt Memorial Lecture. We organize this lecture every year in the month of April. Professor VP Dutt was one of the pioneers of China studies in India. In fact, he started Chinese studies at the University of Delhi way back in 1964. A little bit about Professor Dutt, which I repeat here, as some of you may be attending this lecture for the first time. Professor Dutt was born in Sialkot, which is now in West Punjab, Pakistan, and he did his had his undergrad education at Lahore University. Then he went to Stanford University, where he did a master's in international relations. And I think that is what got him interested in China. And then, along with his wife, few years later, he went to China for the part of the Indian students delegation to study about China, and that was part of the first cultural exchange program between the two countries. And he lived in China for about 4 years, I think. And after returning, he finished his PhD on the Chinese Revolution of 1911 from the School of International Studies. Then he proceeded to Harvard University on a research fellowship. And after he returned to India, he set up the Center for China Studies at Delhi University, which later on became the Department of Chinese and Japanese Studies. And even later, it came to be known as the Department of East Asian Studies. Because China, Japan, and Korea are all taught in that department. This is an opportunity for us to pay our tribute to Professor Dutt, and we have been doing this memorial lecture since 2014, and very eminent scholars have delivered lectures here. Well, about our speaker, Professor Hans van der Ven, I want to express my deep gratitude to him for agreeing to deliver this lecture this time. We were initially not sure whether it will be offline or online. Finally, it was decided that since things are not very, certain, I mean, things are not very stable, let's have it online. And of course, India International decided to, join us in this, event, and we are grateful to them also. And I am not, going through the CV of Professor van der Ven, which has been distributed. Shruti has already mentioned the important points. As Deputy Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University, it's a matter of great, joy and pride for us that he is our speaker for today. And this lecture will be moderated by Dr. Madhavi Thampi, who is an honorary fellow at the institute and also has been teaching Chinese history at the University of Delhi for many years and has worked on India-China interactions in the pre-war period. So she is probably, in the pre-1959 period, most appropriate person to moderate this lecture. So I now hand it over to Dr. Madhavi Thampi to carry on with the proceedings, and I think she'll give you the details of the timings, etc. Over to you, Madhavi.
Thank you, Srimati. Is Anuradha Dutt here? Shruti, is Anuradha here?
Not yet.
Not yet, ma'am.
Okay, then should I go ahead?
Yeah, I think you should go ahead, and if she joins, then at the end of the lecture, she can say a few words.
All right. Anyway, before we turn to the much anticipated lecture by Professor Van de Ven in a few minutes, I would just like to add my own very brief tribute to Professor VP Dutt. I regard him as one of the key institution builders of China studies and more broadly East Asian studies in India. He was a very well-known figure in Delhi and India generally because he was also had a role in public life. His eminence enhanced the profile, I would say, of China studies in India. At the same time, he devoted a lot of attention to building the department, which, as Srimati mentioned, was first the Center for China Studies, then the Department of Chinese and Japanese Studies under him. And he was particularly, conscious of younger scholars, and he, was interested in mentoring and encouraging younger scholars and attracting them to this field. And personally, I think he was mostly responsible for my joining the department, which I remained in till I retired a few years ago. Now, Professor Dutt is better known maybe in India as an expert on Chinese and Indian foreign policy, but I would like to remind the audience here that his training was really in modern Chinese history. He did his dissertation on the 1911 revolution in China. And so it is really appropriate that today we have one of the finest historians of 20th century China, Professor Hans van der Ven, delivering the VP Dutt Memorial Lecture. So, Professor Van de Ven, over to you now for the evening's lecture, which is titled Japan's Surrender in 1945 and the Remaking of Asia. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much indeed for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to say how delighted I am to be here, to be in India, and to have been asked to give this lecture. Which is a wonderful honor, and I've been doing some work in the Nehru archives, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and I've come across the name Dutt more and more in various bits of paper. So my curiosity about the Dutt lineage in Indian and Chinese relations has only increased. I gather I should speak for about 30 minutes, and I will try to keep to that. There's a lot to cover, so I'm going to just jump right in, except that I'd like to say that I don't think my connection is all that good. So if the streaming doesn't work, please let me know, and I just have to repeat myself, and we'll just have to work things through. As I'm sure we all know, actually, on 15 August, Emperor Hirohito took to the airwaves for the first time in his life to say personally that Japan had to bear the unbearable. That's the English translation of what he had to say. And that was the end of, that was Japan's supposed acceptance of the Potsdam conditions for surrender. I guess, as we also all know, the Potsdam demand that Japan surrendered unconditionally is kind of true and is kind of not true. Japan really only surrendered after it was made clear that Emperor Hirohito and the Constitution of Japan would remain in place. Today, what I want to do is not so much talk about Hirohito or the American side of this question, but to look at what happened on the ground after this surrender in China, in Indonesia, as well as in India. And in my mind, this is a moment you could think of as sort of a liminal moment. Lots of things could suddenly happen or could suddenly not happen. And where things would go would very much depend on what the main actors decided to do at this point in time. The main actors being Chiang Kai-shek and Mao in China, Mountbatten, Nehru, Gandhi in India, and people like Hatta, Muhammad Hatta, Sukarno, and Sultan Syahrir in Indonesia. So it's a liminal moment. In some ways, it's better to think of it as a Clausewitzian moment, the Clausewitz on war, by which I mean that these people had they didn't have full command over the situation. They had to act as much on the basis of instinct and intuition, like commanders in a wartime situation, without really a great deal of certainty about where things might go. At the same time, I will describe this sort of as a liminal moment, a Clausewitzian moment, but also one in which there were long-term developments, I think especially related to different trajectories of militarization in India, in China, and in Indonesia that would have a huge impact on each three countries in the decades that followed Japan's surrender. I should say something about unconditional surrender. It was a demand, it was an initiative by President Franklin Roosevelt, announced in 1943, January 1943, at the Casablanca Conference after the Allies, after the UK and the United States, I should say, took North Africa. And Roosevelt was never very clear about his ultimate motives or ultimate ideas, so we can only guess why he did this. Some of those guesses include the idea that he had to signal to Stalin that that the US and the UK would continue to the war and would ultimately assist Stalin in Europe as well. I think that was one motivation. I think Roosevelt was an absolutely wonderful administrator, great politician. What he wanted to avoid was all kinds of internal bickering about war demands during the war itself. Much better to keep the alliance together without being clear about these things until Japan surrendered, and then you can face up to these problems. But I think Roosevelt was also after, that's my guess, after gaining, you will only gain the authority, the legitimacy to reshape the world if you have the unconditional surrender of the enemy. And I think it was that power that he was after with unconditional surrender, if only to reshape the world so that there would not be a third world war. If America was going to fight, if he was going to call on America who really did not want to be involved in this war, to make the ultimate sacrifice, then you better have the kind of victory that will enable you to reshape the world. At the same time, I mean, I think that's all understandable and in some ways, in the long durée, certainly justifiable. There's also, I think, in my mind, no doubt that the unconditional surrender meant that the casualty rates, the death rates in the last year of the war were far higher than if a negotiated settlement had been reached with Japan, which was which had been possible at least for a year. So I think that just needs to be said, and we need to get it out of the way. In the United States, scholarship on the unconditional surrender has really focused on whether or not the use by Truman of the atomic bombs over Nagasaki and Hiroshima was justified. I don't want to talk about that. Truman himself, of course, said that he was utterly convinced it was the right thing to do. But I want to get under sort of move beyond that and look at what was happening in China, in India, and Indonesia. My aim there is to develop not an American perspective on the Second World War, but an Asian perspective, to look at this from an Asian perspective on how this developed. And of course, the surrender ceremonies were quite obviously acts of political theater that were meant to do certain things. In Asia, in Japan, it was, of course, General MacArthur who was the director of this piece of political theater. And again, I'm not going to make too much of this, but the Tokyo surrender, one point to make is that it was delayed because there had been a typhoon, and therefore the American troops couldn't arrive in time. So it took a long time, and it only was on September 2 that this could happen. That had consequences in Indonesia, delaying the arrival of the Dutch there. And according to some Dutch historians, that had actually, that made it very difficult for the Dutch to take back control in Indonesia. The argument is that if they had come quickly with all the goods from Australia that they had there, then their position would have been much stronger, but now they had to wait. At this, in Tokyo, the purpose of the surrender, I think, were two. It was attended by people like Arthur Percival, who had surrendered Singapore, General Jonathan Wainwright, who had surrendered the Philippines, and also a Dutch admiral who had surrendered, of course, to represent the Dutch, was Admiral Helfrich. There was only one non-US, non-European, non-US representative there. That was Xu Yongqiang, the Chinese Minister of Military Operations. But I think in one element of this particular surrender in Tokyo Bay was to say, we have avenged the great defeats of Singapore, the surrender of the Philippines, the surrender of Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies. It was also saying, we are back. We Europeans are back. The restoration of the European empires. Americans didn't like it, but they had made some sort of peace with it. There was also a sort of a personal element to this. Commodore Perry's flag, Commodore Perry had opened up Japan in 1858, was flown to Tokyo Bay and displayed on the USS Missouri. I think the other element that MacArthur wanted to show was this was a GI, let's put it a GI Joe's kind of a victory. They were crammed on the decks of the USS Missouri, and Europeans would not have done this. So this was to show that it is the average American who has secured this victory and for whom this victory is made. But of course, it was also to indicate that now the war is over and an era of peace has begun. And I think that was the hope, no doubt the aspiration. And it would prove true to some extent for the United States, but not in China, where the Civil War continued. That had, of course, continued during the Second World War itself. It certainly did not bring peace in Indonesia, where the Republic would fight for its survival against the Dutch, or Vietnam. And of course, we all know the kinds of violences that would also happen elsewhere in Asia, including, of course, India. I first want to look at the surrender in China. And of course, in one way, the surrender in Tokyo Bay was it. There did not need to be any further surrenders. Order number one had made clear who would surrender where to whom, all across East, Southeast Asia, and therefore there were no further surrenders necessary. But of course, the various countries wanted to get engaged in these symbolic displays of power and initiative. And so once MacArthur had taken Japan's surrender in Tokyo Bay, he allowed other surrenders to take place. The one in China took place on the 9th day of the 9th month, so September 9. And that I think, at 9 a.m. in the morning. So this was 999. I think the reference there is in part to 11-11-11-11. The beginning of the armistice that ended the First World War. So it was trying to draw an equivalence between World War I and World War II, and it's including, of course, the China theater. Understandable given that the Second World War in Asia had begun with the invasion of Japan. 9 is also an important religious symbol, and it is, as anybody who knows Chinese knows, it also homophonous with jojo, everlasting. So 3 times jojo, 3 times everlasting, everlasting, everlasting is one way of saying peace must now begin and it will last forever. The surrender took place in Nanjing, which had been, there were a few nationalist troops, the security was still under Japanese control. Some Americans had landed there. The 2 main actors in this surrender in Nanjing, the building of the Central Military Academy, involved 2 people, one being He Yingqin, the commander-in-chief on the Chinese side, and on the Japanese side there was Okamura Yasuji. The surrender was quite short. It was 20 minutes. There were lots of diplomats there, lots of representatives of other allied countries, also a lot of press. There were photographs of Sun Yat-sen. There was a V sign. There was the Chinese characters for peace. And it was all, and it was quite symbolic in that the table for the Chinese delegation was huge and big and elevated. For the Japanese, it was small and they all had to cram together and so on. So it was like, we are the big guys. It was sort of an exchange of documents. First, the credentials were handed over and then sent back, and then you had the surrender document itself and the orders and so on. And this was all very carefully choreographed, except that one thing happened that nobody had anticipated. So when the final document was passed back to General He Yingqin, he stood up and received the document with 2 hands. He was not meant to have stood up because, he was there to denigrate the Japanese. But he did stood up, and this was an act of, let's say, almost say, impulsive courtesy. But it points us to an important reality in this particular surrender, namely, He Yingqin and Okamura Yasuji had actually known each other quite well. They were also classmates of the Japanese Military Academy. They were Tongnian Tongxue. In the 1930s, General He Yingqin had often, on behalf of Chiang Kai-shek, negotiated with Okamura Yasuji for the very embarrassing agreements that had handed so much of North China to Japan. And I think we can pursue this a bit further because we know from the memoirs of Okamura Yasuji that evening the 2 met and talked at length. And they talked about, they reminisced, no doubt, and also talked about the future. It was all very polite. It was He Yingqin who visited Okamura Yasuji, not the other way around. Very, very important in terms of courtesy, of course. And the context here is that in the final weeks, months of the Second World War, the Chinese communists had taken much of North China. They had sent troops to block the return of Chinese troops from Chongqing to the coast, to the big cities. On 11 August, communist forces in Shandong were ordered into Manchuria, where the Soviet rapid advance in Operation August Storm were causing the once mighty Japanese Quantum Army to disintegrate. On 14 August, in a radio broadcast, Mao Zedong labeled Chiang Kai-shek a fascist chieftain, and Zhu De, the communist commander-in-chief, announced to the United States, the UK, and the Soviet Union that he would not accept Chiang Kai-shek's instructions to stay put where he was, where his forces were, and he demanded the Japanese surrender to the communists in all the areas where they controlled. Moreover, on August 9, the day the first atomic bomb exploded, Mao ordered communist forces to expand aggressively, and the day after, he said, we now will activate our plans to take Nanjing, Beijing, Tianjin, Tangshan, and Baoding, all crucial areas. In other words, the point I'm trying to make is that in reality, despite the surrender ceremony, despite the attempts to suggest that the Japanese were surrendering to a mighty force, in reality, the nationalists needed the Japanese very badly indeed. Okamura Yasuji was in charge of 1 million troops that had never been defeated. The morale of these troops remained high, and the nationalists needed these troops in order to keep the communists out of the big cities and to limit any expansion they might be thinking of, and to give the nationalists time to get their acts together and try to recover the coastal areas. Now, Okomaru Yasuji, I think very interestingly from his memoirs, we know that he had been considering what to do in case Japan was going to surrender. And he had made various plans and so on. One of the plans he made was to withdraw Japanese troops to Shandong and then ship them back to Japan. And he had negotiated with the Chinese communists to allow them for this to happen. The communists were, of course, very happy with any such deal. But he had changed his mind in discussions with Tokyo and said, no, in reality, we cannot have a communist China. We need the Chinese market to restore the Japanese economy after this surrender. And therefore, we will work with the Chinese nationalists. So again, the Japanese were down, definitely. They were defeated, but they were not out. They had options, and they pursued definite options that ultimately, of course, would not pan out for them, or maybe ultimately they did, but ultimately, the communists would be victorious. But the Japanese feared a communist China under the control of the Soviet Union. That would not be good for Japan's future. So better to make a gamble and stick with the nationalists. And there, the relationship between He Yingqin and Okomaru Yasuji was, of course, very important. There was another little sideshow here, which is also interesting, and I'll be very brief about this. Chiang Kai-shek also used the surrender to dispatch forces from Yunnan to North Vietnam, to North Indochina, to take the surrender of the Japanese there. He did so because then his forces in Yunnan would be able to, and as they did, to surround the home of General Long Yun, who had remained virtually independent throughout the Second World War, throughout the War of Resistance. And General Long Yun was put for the choice of either you stay here in Yunnan, in Kunming, or you become Minister of Forestry in Chongqing, in other words, under Chiang Kai-shek's control. You choose. And he knew he had reached the end of the road and accepted his appointment. And so Chiang Kai-shek used this to bring an end to the independence, the virtual independence, autonomy, let's put it that way, of Yunnan province, and to end the career of Long Yun. A very wild, a very smart, clever politician, and of course very well liked by foreigners and China's intellectuals. It gave them a lot of freedom. Well, now I want to turn to Indonesia. And here let me begin by making a couple of points. First was that during much of the Second World War, Indonesia was a bit of a quiet backwater militarily. It had been important during the beginning of the Pacific War. After all, the Japanese were after the oil in Indonesia. That's the whole reason they went south. Pearl Harbor was important in that context, but not in its own right, to destroy the Japanese Navy. The Allies, the United States and the UK, did not know much about Indonesia. And they expected that the Dutch would simply walk back in and take over. They did not realize what had happened from the Japanese occupation in March 1942. A June 1945 US State Department overview stated, and I'm quoting, conditions that at the conclusion of the war in Indonesia, there will probably a generally quiescent period in the relations between the Dutch and the native population, and that the self-sufficient native economy can probably revive in full volume very shortly after the cessation of hostilities. Nobody was thinking about an Indonesian revolution. They didn't know about it. This was a Dutch failure of intelligence. There's no other way of putting it. The Dutch had put out, some had retreated to Australia. There was a Dutch intelligence service under General Spoor, and clearly didn't have much of an idea of what actually was happening in Indonesia. I think in the case of Indonesia, in other words, when Sukarno and Hatta declared Indonesia an independent republic in Indonesia, everybody was surprised. And General Hubert van Mook, who was the new Governor General, the Lieutenant Governor General, in fact, did not think this was a very serious threat at all. And when he set off from Australia, he said, well, I will bring Sukarno back in a cage. And of course, that didn't happen. In fact, it was a very chaotic period that then began in Indonesia. And I think here, one of the interesting things is that Van Mook, who would do so much to fight Sukarno, actually in many ways was a very progressive person. He was born in Indonesia. Unlike in British Malaya or Burma, the Dutch had decided to stay put. So hundreds of thousands of Dutch people were in Japanese concentration camps. But for Van Mook had thought about a new future for the Dutch Empire. And this was accepted, and various orders had been given. The Dutch Queen had declared support for this. They talked about a future Dutch Empire consisting of 4 elements: the Netherlands, Indonesia, Suriname, and Curaçao, each of equal standing, each of equal rights. And for people like Van Mook, who are far more committed to Indonesia, thought of themselves as natural inhabitants of Indonesia. This would be a future Dutch kingdom centered around Indonesia as the much bigger, larger part. So there was one future that was possible, but that of course did not happen. Instead, it was the future that people like Sukarno, Mohammed Hatta, and Sultan Shahriar displayed. I guess another point to make is that one reason it all was so deeply chaotic was that on August 15, the day of the Japanese surrender, responsibility for Indonesia, as well as for Indonesia, was shifted from MacArthur to Mountbatten. And the Dutch had hoped that the Dutch very much wanted to stay under American oversight because the Americans were far richer. Or they had given all kinds of promises about supplies that they could take to Indonesia. And Mountbatten was the SEAC, the Supreme Southeast Asia Command, was poorer, far fewer troops, there were not so many supplies. And of course, SIAC had many other responsibilities, including India itself, but Burma and French China. And for Mountbatten, Indonesia was actually rather less important than French China. On August 15, Sukarno and Hatta actually returned from a trip that they had made to Vietnam to Count Terauchi, who was the commander-in-chief of the southern areas. And Count Terauchi had told them, you must declare independence quickly. Count Terauchi had been quite hesitant to accept the general's unconditional surrender demand and resisted it. He was one of the great. So when the Allies doubted, will all these forces go accept the surrender? He was one of the great doubts in their minds. And he was clearly using the growth of the independence movement in order to make life difficult for the Allies. When the Japanese arrived in Indonesia, they already had promised independence. That had been stepped up since the fall of 1944, when Koiso, the prime minister then, had stated that that Indonesia should become independent. And that those processes were stepped up very quickly in the spring of 1945, when there was a lot of discussions and debates about constitutions. They were organized, and Sukarno was in charge of that. And they made, constitutional arrangements were made, preparations were made to hand over ministry and so on. And then when in August 1945, Sukarno and Hatta went to see Terauchi, said, now you must move quickly. When Sukarno and Hatta arrived back in Jakarta, he heard that the Japanese had surrendered. He couldn't believe it. He said, no way. No way, Japanese do not surrender, doesn't happen. So he didn't know what to do. And Hatta was also just seeing what was going to happen. In fact, Sukarno and Hatta were then taken prisoner by a youth movement, the Pemudas in Indonesia, to pressure them to declare independence. And that was a movement probably in which Sudan Shahir who had been underground in the way that and Muhammad Hatta and Sukarno had collaborated with the Japanese, cooperated with the Japanese. Shahir probably was important in making this happen. So then they did declare independence on August 17. And that would continue it would begin a struggle that would continue for the next 4 years. In which ultimately Sukarno and Hatta, of course, the republic would prevail. But so in that moment, history could have gone many, many, many different ways, indeed. I'm going to make that point a little later. And yeah, let me do that. I want to sort of briefly say something about India. I'm running out of time, so I will just surmise that. For the Indian situation, we of course have to look at the surrender in Singapore, because there was a surrender for all of SIAC, really. And it was of course Mountbatten who oversaw this surrender. The people in attendance. This happened on September 12th, so even later than China. In the council chamber of Singapore, this building surrounded by 1,000 people. The Allied side, famous generals like William Slim, who's one of the few whose reputation remains intact, but also Arthur Power, the commander of the Indian fleet, and Keith Part for the effort. They were present. On the Japanese side, it was General Itagaki, who stood in for Terauchi, who was ill. Mountbatten sent his own physician there to make sure that Count Terauchi really was ill, and that was declared to be true. Now, Mountbatten's aim in the Singapore surrender ceremony, and again, the Indians, they had provided most of the forces. They were quite upset, quite angry at the Indian army, the Indians within it, that there was so little representation of Indian persons at this surrender ceremony. Mountbatten's aim with this surrender ceremony was he really went out of his way to suggest that it is overwhelming force that is forcing the Japanese to come here and to surrender to us unconditionally. That's the point he was trying to drive home in this particular ceremony. But of course, the reality on the ground was more difficult. He had few troops actually available over a vast territory, from French Indochina, Burma, India itself, and then Indonesia, Malaya, not to mention as well. And his task, he had been given orders to try to help the British, to help the French and the Dutch back into the saddle. And that was difficult because he largely had to rely on the Indian army. And he sent forces first to French Indochina, and then he sent Sikh and Gurkha forces into Indonesia. And I'm sure you all notice, like I'm very brief about this, but that was difficult. And one of the things that Nehru did was to raise this issue publicly. You are not allowed, or Mountbatten should not use Indian forces to resurrect empires in South and Southeast Asia and East Asia. And the other issue that that made it, he was actually, Mountbatten actually was in a quite weak position. And as it's of course very famous in an Indian context. I can guarantee you, the Chinese audiences know nothing about this and find this all very interesting. But there was the issue of the surrender of Subhas Chandra Bose. I've been reading some of the documents about that. He flew to Taipei, Taihoku as it was called then, and his airplane caught fire, and supposedly he died when in a hospital not shortly after. As you know, there's all kinds of rumors about that. This might not actually be the real truth. He may have gone to China or to Burma. I've even seen rumors that actually he went to Ireland. I think that's the most unlikely story. He would have really stood out there, but I don't think that's very likely at all. But Mountbatten, so then, part of the Mountbatten was the British were trying, people like Achenbeck and Wavell were also making a big issue of the INA, of Netaji's forces, of Bose's forces, and they wanted to court-martial them and put them in prison, and all that happened. And again, Nehru drove immediately, quite quickly, in August, September. He began to raise this as a huge issue, and don't do that. And as you all know, in the end, the British had to give up on pursuing the INA, and even the Indian army was deeply sympathetic to the INA and did not want them to be pursued at all. And so it meant that actually the British position lacked the kinds of military power. It was clear from the Quit India campaign, if not before, well before, I would have thought, that ultimately that power rested on brutal military force, and it was simply no longer available to the British. Now, I think the longer term processes at play here were the patterns of militarization. There's very briefly, in the case of China, if we look at the Chinese communists, what Mao did during the Second World War was to create this hugely disciplined political party that would actually control the gun. And that enabled him to seize power, to come out of this desolate Yan'an with nothing, with military forces that hardly had any guns, let alone any. Ultimately, by 49, he was in control of all of China. So he used the power to discipline that military force and to mobilize Chinese society, to draw power out of the poorest parts of China, to create a force that not only occupied all of China, but also fought the Americans to a standstill in the Korean War. In the case of India, it is the buildup of the Indian Army in the Second World War, and I think its adoption of things like military discipline that ultimately shaped and sort of the officer-soldier relationships that shaped India's history. And of course, Pakistan's would be very difficult. In the case of Indonesia, militarization is very different. The Japanese first created PETA out of some forces, the Dutch military forces, Dutch as in the Dutch were in charge, but it was Indonesian populated. Then they drew in yet another different force, the Heiho. And in the end, they also allowed Muslims to join a force that was called Hezbollah. And that became a very large number indeed. So I think there the militarization was much more scattered, fragmented, and that created the kinds of a situation in which military coups became much more disciplined. It was all dependent on the military figures became very important. So this is to briefly indicate the kinds of things that I'll be talking about in the book that I hope to write in the end. But I think it's the militarizations, both before the Second World War and then what happened during the Second World War itself, that would have a huge impact on the future of the three countries, of China, of Indonesia, and India itself. And with that, I think I should hand back to our chair. So thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you very much for this really very different perspective on the war and the surrender of Japan at the end of the war. It becomes clear that there was not one surrender but several surrenders, and that the different surrenders took place in very different conditions. And also had different consequences. One thing which I got out of your presentation is that, the surrender, which is seen as the end of everything in conventional, or I would say Western or maybe American portrayal of the war, was actually, are you saying this, that in various places it was actually the beginning, or rather the amplification of war, or yes, contention in yes, different places? That is one takeaway which I got from this, which I think is really important, because it was not really the end of anything, but it was also the beginning. And 1945 as, of course, 1945 is extremely important as a marker, but it was also just one marker in a series of conflicts that going on in this part of the world, and some of which did not end until the 1950s, really, in many places. So I think we can open for discussion. People can put their questions in the chat box, or they can raise their hand also. But in the meantime, if I could just ask you this question of, so far you have really concentrated on China and World War II and China's military history, China's warfare, China and Japan. And, what made you venture into, these other parts of Asia and to try to expand your geographical focus? If you could just...
Yeah, I can.
Mm-hmm.
But first of all, yes, you're absolutely right. What I'm trying to say is that 1945 may be a good endpoint from a UK or US perspective for the Second World War. But I think it continued. Mm-hmm. And not just in Asia, but actually, I think there's more and more scholarship to show that in Europe too, the amounts of violence and death and famine, especially in Eastern Europe, was also horrendous. And so that the whole idea of saying it all ended in 1945, that just no longer stacks up. I think I'm right in saying, I think actually in Asia, the consequences of the Second World War were far more pronounced than they would be in Europe, both in the terms of the numbers of victims, and I would include the victims of famine, who were clearly war-related, in Bengal, in Java, as well as in North Indochina, and of course in Henan and many other places. I think there are many other places we don't actually know about. So that is one reason I think that we need to look at. But I also want to make the point that we can only take, what we should try to do, America no in a limited degree, is to take Japan's empire seriously as an empire. And therefore we need to look at the various bits of empire that they put together. Now that's a huge span of territory. We need to include Taiwan, Korea, Manchuria, and so on and so on. I can't do everything, but I thought it would be interesting that the reason I decided to sort of develop an Asian perspective by looking at China, Indonesia, and India is because they are the three largest countries. I was very keen to include Indonesia because it is a huge country. And I've, as I mentioned earlier to you, there's a family connection there that my own father fought there. So that makes it more personal, and that makes the kinds of questions you want to think about also more interesting, I think, and more thoughtful. But also, I think the case of India is very important, as is the case, and in many ways, of India itself, Indonesia and India. One of the things that in doing this research, I'm more and more alert to, and I didn't mention it, but there was every chance that Indonesia would have come out of these processes in 1945 as an Islamic country. There was actually Sukarno in the debate about the constitution. The initial point was that the president would have to be Islamic, a Muslim, and Sukarno managed to get it out and not do that. And Sukarno was, clever like that. But so the influence of Islam and the problems that come with that, and that I think is a sort of in the effects of the Second World War are deeper in that you have the collapse of empires, the emergence of all kinds of new states, but also all kinds of questions about identity, about religion, about faith, and about communism are all there too, bubbling away. Not just bubbling away, they become hugely important and are being sort of worked out as this process continues. So I think that in that way, the effects really in Asia really were profound and are now reshaping not just Asia but the whole world.
Thank you. I think we have a couple of questions here. Colonel Burma has written that in Burma, Indian troops under Field Marshal Slim checked Japan's advance and converted it into victory from defeat. This may also play an important part in the remaking of Asia. Would you like to comment on that? Or?
Yes. I have stayed away from Burma because there's quite a bit of writing about the war in Burma, but I think that's right. And I think that's where I need to do. I could do a lot. I mean, Burma is a very complicated situation, of course. Again, you end up with very strong military. One of the reasons it's interesting is because both the nationalists believe, well, they were right. I believe that part of North Burma were actually part of China, and that the treaties between the British and the Chinese did to sovereignty. So that continued to play a role in the Second World War, as Chiang Kai-shek kept making that point, and he wanted his troops there. So there's a lot of issues to talk about in that particular context. So yeah, I mean, Burma could be brought in as well.
I guess Korea, Vietnam, all of them.
There's Vietnam, there's Korea, and I'll have to mention those, but I want to sort of, I would need another 100 years to do it. So I can't, and I can talk a little bit about it, but yeah, I think it's the Indonesia, India, and China, just because of their size and their weight and the complexities, are for me the better case studies. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we have one more question from Apurva Raj. He says, did General Okamura's employment as the military advisor to the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek lead to any post-war collaboration between Japan and the Kuomintang Party? And he also asks, were the arms export restrictions on Japan crucial in helping the communists who were backed by the Soviets get an edge over the nationalists of the KMT? I think, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yes, there were arrangements. It's called the so-called White Group. Was a group of advisors that advised the KMT on Taiwan for many years, actually. So yes, there were arrangements between Japan and the KMT. Interesting, Okamura Yasuji, the Americans wanted him brought to Tokyo to stand trial there. The nationalists refused to comply with that, so he saved his life that way. I think in terms of arms exports, there's a larger picture there. Yes, the embargo of arms exports to the nationalists was important, but it was part of a general assessment of the Americans that they, and I think they just misjudged it. In 48, they stopped supplying the nationalists with weapons, believing, well, Chiang Kai-shek was asking for more and more and more and more. Relations between Marshall, who was foreign secretary at that point, and the nationalists were very bad indeed, for often understandable reasons. But Marshall just didn't believe that they actually had run out of ammunition, and they had. So they thought, in order to make Chiang Kai-shek do what we want him to do, which is have a deal with the communists and become democratic, as if that was possible, we need to withhold arms to him in order to improve his behavior. As a result, in Manchuria, the nationalist forces had to withdraw into cities and try to defend them with what they had. And ultimately, the communists had developed the abilities, artillery power, in order to gradually destroy them, to destroy these forces. The communists also used, as happened in many other places, they used famine as a weapon of war. They starved the city of Changchun to death. 300,000 people died. It is, of course, one of the great war crimes, of which there were, of course, many on all sides in the Second World War. So yes, the prohibition of arms export was important, but there's the general American strategy. And I think simply a misjudgment of where the nationalists were at militarily. It was not a communist plot as was argued in the 1950s, but that's nonsense. But I think it was misjudgment.
Thank you. We have a question from Shruti. Shruti, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. And thank you, Professor, for that very interesting lecture. And my question, because I'm not a student of history, so my question might be a bit simple, but you mentioned in your title that surrender of Japan and remaking of Asia. And but you ended on these three countries, China, India, and Indonesia. So what I was wondering was that what impact did this surrender have on Asia as a regional entity, Asia as a continent, or even were there new connections that developed between these countries because of this short period of intense kind of an imperialism? Yeah, that's my
Great.
question.
That's a lovely question. Thank you very much indeed. I think it is, perhaps most simply put, these surrenders and the way that they played out meant the end of European empires, which, you know, were possible to be revived in 1945. There's an interesting book by Mark Mazow, a historian I admire greatly, about the United Nations, making clear that the UN was initially set up. They would have adjusted, despite American opposition to European imperialism. They would have adjusted. The UN would have been arranged in such a way. It was arranged by people like Jan Smuts, one of the great imperialist figures from South Africa, that his empires could be revived. And of course, people like Mountbatten, Dutch, the French, all tried to do this. But I think the surrenders, the way they played out, the kind of forces they brought into existence, meant that these the forces of revolution in China, of nationalism, of republicanism, of the desires both to, of those forces became hugely, they won the battle for the future, to put it that way. And they also began to reshape, and I, this would be for sort of later chapters, later talks, but they also began to, I think, reshape the global order. And ultimately that leads to the non-aligned movement, the Bandung Conference. And you see people like Muhammad Hatta writing to Nehru as they are trying to fight the Dutch. And you see people like Nehru actually beginning to use the United Nations to make the case against empire and for Indonesian independence, the Indonesian Republic. And he's, Nehru actually sends Krishna Menon to the UN. He sends, and Susan Shahia from Indonesia is at that point in Delhi. He also sends him to the United Nations. And they make this huge case about an end to empire and a new world of nationalisms in Asia. And they help reshape the UN at that point in time. So yes, there are connections. And these histories are complicated, of course. Nehru also tries to bring in China, and ultimately that becomes a great disappointment for him. I think Nehru is rather naive about China, both the nationalists and the communists, but he tries to reshape the world that way. And so I think the reshaping of Asia itself in these various countries, but also of international relations that comes out of this, it does change things fundamentally.
We have a question from Professor Swapna Bhattacharya. Please go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes.
I don't want to make a long comment. Actually, I'm not sure whether you have, or if not, then you please read my book, India-Myanmar Relation 1886 to 1948. What I wanted to say beyond that is aspiration to stay on was there also among the Tories, the conservative in Burma. So what you said is not exactly the right thing. Actually, there is a book called The Blueprint of Burma. There was a plan which I have detailed, this discussion in this book. And I would also like to focus that the complexity which played over these countries, Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia and Burma, vis-a-vis India, Nehru and all that, what you have said, is much more complex. I have a long experience of teaching decolonization, and scholars from your country are also familiar with my works on Myanmar. So what I wanted to say is that there are so many other factors, if you put the facts that you have placed, of course, very skillfully, I would really like to ask the question, because, Burma became independent because of so many reasons. And also the Rakhine state, the Arakan, people are talking about Rakhine Muslims, but the complexity, and for that also, if you have not read, I would like to request you to read from Manohar, the Rakhine state of Myanmar, India, that is also there, and about your Islam and Indonesia. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that I don't believe that Indonesia would have been a Muslim country, because you know, in Indonesia, Islam is so sophisticated, and so many elements of Buddhism and Hinduism are there, and here also name of Tagore comes, and on that also I have produced another book. I don't want to propagate my books, but certainly in your country my works are also admired across the world. So, and I am also here cordially invited. I just wanted to say also, I am very happy to see respected Sahai, and who came to see me in my department, and Madhavi and Chakravarti, Professor Chakravarti, Madhavi Thambi. Your works are also so nice and so informative. I wanted to stop here by telling that the time has come, in the context of what is happening today in the Indo-Pacific. I think we should be more informative, more critical, not necessarily against any European countries. I have been groomed in Germany, in Heidelberg also, partly also in Shantiniketan. So this is my humble suggestion or submission. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So
I will
say that the British and French also made all these mistakes in Vietnam. And in Burma, of course, the last chapter of my book, India-Myanmar relation, is titled Hours Before Independence. And there, the separatist movement in northern Rakhine states is also discussed, and many other issues, you know, which are not actually this blueprint of Burma. That book is very, very important. It must be in London. I saw it in National Library. It is included. And there was a very strong case, you know, from the Tories, the conservative, that Burma should not be made independent at this point of time, when actually everything was settled. And Aung San and Nehru, you know, decolonization, this is constitution building, all this came later on, little bit later. Everything is, there is a lot of overlapping. So this is my humble submission. Thank you very much, all the respected scholars and many friends here.
Would you like to respond to that?
I can. I thank you very much. History is complicated, all kinds of factors at play. And I have enjoyed, I've been stimulated by getting some sense of all the kinds of things that were going on. And I see it as my job to make those clear, to write those, hopefully, while doing justice to the complexity of it all. Burma is something that I will read more about. I'm very happy to do that. But I think my main points about the significance of this period in Asian history, I sense actually you are in agreement with that.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any more
I just wanted to say that INA movement, that is also extremely important and became a factor in the award of independence.
Yeah. I mentioned it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else wants to ask a question or raise their hand?
Yes, madam.
Okay, Ruth,
allow me.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Madam, you know, while introducing Professor Dutt, one point was missing, which I thought of mentioning it here. He was two-time nominated members of Rajya Sabha. And I have a special association with both Professor VP Dutt and Gargi Dutt. Incidentally, I was the last PhD student of Madam Gargi Dutt. My latest book, my book, which I recently wrote on Hong Kong, I've dedicated this book to both VP Dutt and Gargi Dutt. This is the book which I've dedicated to both Professor VP Dutt and Gargi Dutt. Now, We heard a very insightful comments by Professor Van. I just thought of, knowing his comments on Biju Patnaik's efforts to, when he flew to Jakarta in Indonesia to rescue General Hatta and Sukarno, to enable them to participate in the Asian Relations Conference, which was held in 1946, prior to India's independence. Could you offer comment on that? And secondly, going back to past, maybe 1942, when just Japan had taken over Hong Kong. So my question is that, was there any discussion about whether Hong Kong, in the British circle, in the British foreign policy, was there any discussion that to surrender Hong Kong to China? And then Churchill commented that he is not Her Majesty's Prime Minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. Could you could comment on that? Thank you very much.
Yes. Oh, the history of Hong Kong and surrender is full of complexity. You can write many books about that. Part of the complexities was that, of course, Chiang Kai-shek wanted Hong Kong. He would have liked it very much. And the British wanted Hong Kong. And I've gone through Chiang Kai-shek diaries, but also the discussions of the six, the Imperial General Staff, the Council of Imperial General Staff, about Hong Kong. And initially, they stressed, they said, we must take Hong Kong because that is the one place we're going to have to put people on land in Asia, and also, of course, to use it as a harbor. They didn't want to surrender the Pacific to the Americans at that point. And they thought they still had a future role to play in China itself. There was a real consciousness of, we have had a lot of assets in a lot of investments, a lot of capital investment in China, and we need to protect that. We also want to
I think Professor Van de Ven has lost connectivity.
Okay, connection is gone. What should we do, Rija?
Ma'am, we can wait for a few seconds for him to log back in. Or else I think we might have to request Anuradha ma'am to step in for her remarks.
Yes, but can you ask Professor Van de Ven to maybe log out and come back in? Yeah,
yeah, I think he's...
Yeah. Okay, so in the meantime, we are very happy that Anuradha Dutt, who is Professor VP Dutt's daughter, is here. She was not able to join before it started. So, Anuradha, would you please make a few remarks now? Well,
actually,
call you in at this time like this.
No, I'm very grateful to the center for hosting this. Every year, you're kind enough to do this. I learn a lot. I'm a lawyer by profession, so I did BA history and have a little bit knowledge, not much. So it's been very interesting and insightful, and I hope this tradition will continue. So thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Anuradha. You have been, you're thanking ICS, but you have been very, very instrumental in allowing us to hold this
Thank you.
annual memorial lecture.
Thank you.
All right. Rija, anything,
Ma'am, I think Professor Van de Ven is still facing issue. He hasn't logged back in yet.
Okay.
So
we can just wait a little. I just wanted to, tell people who are here while waiting for Professor Van de Ven that he is one of the foremost, military historians of China. He has studied warfare in China and military history of China, and with specific focus on the 20th century, but even earlier. So I think one of the, things that he has really done, especially in his recent work, recent means I think 3-4 years ago, called China at War, is to sort of suggest that the war, China was in a period of, was in a whole period of warfare in the whole middle of the 20th century, and that one should not just look at, the war of resistance in isolation from the civil war that followed, but that it's a continuous period of warfare, out of which emerged many things, including, of course, the establishment of the rule of the Communist Party. And so he has been, working towards a kind of integrated view of the war and the military history of China. So I would really suggest that those of you who are interested in this talk, do read his books. One of them, the latest one, is China at War, which is a really comprehensive history of the period of the war, which looks at, and his thesis is that warfare in China really began really in the 1930s and ended only with the Korean War, which kind of consolidated the power of the Communist Party and established China's international position. So this is a very different view and a different perspective on both China's military history as well as Second World.
Professor Thampi, I think Professor Van de Ven is back.
Okay, very good.
Welcome back, Professor. Can you hear us?
But nobody is. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
Can we see you?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Ran out of data, and so I got back on Wi-Fi. I think I was answering a question of Hong Kong.
Yes.
Would you probably have moved on from that?
No, in between we had Anuradha Dutt, who was Professor VP Dutt's daughter, who was actually scheduled to speak earlier. So she said a few words, and
Great.
So if you would like to just carry on with your response to Rupnar and Das, and then there are a couple of more questions in the chat box. So
great. Britain was their ally, and in the end,
Professor, your voice is breaking.
policy that was emerged already.
Your voice is breaking. If you can switch off the video, the quality will be better.
Okay, I will stop my video. Right. Okay. I hope this is a bit better.
yes, this is good.
Yep. Okay. So we played a complicated game where they signaled to Chiang Kai-shek that they were in favor of China regaining Hong Kong, but in reality they did not stand in the way of the British resuming control over Hong Kong. And so the British rushed towards Hong Kong be there before any nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek could get there. And he simply had to adjust to that reality. So yeah, that's I think all I really wanted to say about Hong Kong.
Okay, I think we have 3 more questions, and I think these will be the 3 last questions. Maybe if you can take them one after the other, would that be all right?
Yes, I can only see one.
Okay, there is one saying from Ranjan Matai saying, was there any specific decision regarding Taiwan between Chiang and General Okamura? That was one question. And then Mr. Venkatraman said, is asking, what was the impact of World War II in Asia on the armed forces of India, China, and Indonesia? You sort of a little bit touched on that in your talk, but maybe you can elaborate. And Gaurav Datta has asked, this is the last question, was Indonesia the most strategically important Southeast Asian country for Japan during the Second World War? And how do you view Japan's engagement towards Sukarno during the period of confrontasi?
Yeah.
Okay, these are the three. So if you want to take them one by one.
Okay, I'll begin with first. It is a very complicated one. Indonesia was important strategically because it had the oil and many other resources on which the Japanese war machine depended. And one of the reasons that I think all this, something you don't find in books written in the United States or Britain, but the Dutch had an option of, before Pearl Harbor, before the beginning of the Strike South campaign, the Japanese had sent diplomatic missions to try to convince the Dutch to supply the oil on a commercial basis to Japan. The Dutch could have done that, but the Dutch decided not to do that. And the reason was that, one of the reasons was that they were terribly embarrassed by the rapidity with which the Dutch had surrendered to the Germans and the cost that came with that. And so they decided to build up the Indonesian army, the KNIL, and try to fight the Japanese. So they too had choice at this point, and they very clearly decided early on that they would side with the British, maybe less so because the Dutch-British relations were not that good, but especially the United States. So they had this choice. And in fact, the Dutch were the first of the Allies to declare war on Japan. They did before the British and the Americans. That it was prepared, and Van Mook, as soon as he heard that the attack had happened on Pearl Harbor, immediately, and of course, it was still, he could do this, he was the first to go on the radio. He had not had confirmation from London, from the Dutch government in exile, but declared war on Japan. He wanted to force the issue. He himself was in this interest man, but I'm going to skip that. Now, after that, I think the Indonesia remained important because the oil, and it forced the Japanese Navy to stay close to, after the supply lines between Indonesia and Japan were cut. Therefore, the Japanese Navy had to stay close to Indonesia if it wanted to get the oil that it needed. So that affected the way that the Japanese Navy could operate. And that's why the Japanese Navy ended up in Singapore, which is, of course, very close to Indonesia. As to Taiwan, there was not in 1945. I don't think there was any discussion. I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. But I don't think there was any discussion between Okamura Yasuji and He Ying-jin at that point. I think they still hoped to win, to conquer, to be in control over all of China. And it was in 48, I think, that Chiang Kai-shek, no, maybe early 47, Chiang Kai-shek decided to turn Taiwan into a base from which to continue resistance. As he had done in 1937, 1937, he made Sichuan province, Chongqing, into the last base from which to continue any resistance. One of the points that I have made in China, which is always appreciated, is that actually communists did not have a total victory because they didn't get Taiwan. That was a result. I think it was really a result of Chiang Kai-shek's decision. And I'm not, no, I think up until at that point, officially, of course, Japan was under US occupation, so it couldn't make any decisions about its foreign relations. Officially, even in 1952, when there's the peace treaty between China and Japan, a lot of people in Japan, important political leaders, would have preferred a signing a treaty with the mainland, again on the basis of the thought that it would be future trade with all of China, with China, mainland China, that would be more important to Japan than having a relationship with this small island called Taiwan. I'm sure there are more questions to be asked about curiosities and the White House role in all this. The impact on schools. I've made some of the points that I wanted to make, and the kinds of concept that drove that militarization was very important. The British example in the case of the Indian Army, the Japanese example, the Japanese militarizations in case of Indonesia was very important, including for making Indonesian youth try to imitate or try to, the Pemuda became highly, how to put it, militant, militaristic, highly masculine. They were imitating the Japanese forms of militarization. And perhaps some of the violence came from that as well. The initial Pemuda violence, both against Chinese, but also against Dutch, became ferocious during 1946, 1945, 46. During the Bersiap period, it was very, very wild indeed. So I think that in the case of the communists, not the nationalists, but communists, I can say quite a lot of that. But this is sort of Mao rethinking, thinking through the question of how do I create a military force capable of defeating the nationalists, of standing up to, how do I create a force that is able to win, despite not having urban centers and despite not having an industrial base. And he develops this concept of liberation war, guerrilla liberation war, national liberation war, in which you move from the countryside, you draw peasants into your military structures, you use those to surround the cities. You then also, people forget this, but you also create an army, very large armies that are capable of fighting conventional war. And of course, he begins to do that under Lin Biao in Manchuria, and begins to build up that kind of force, and then ultimately defeats the nationalists and fights the Americans to a standstill. I think that had a huge impact on guerrilla warfare, for instance, in Vietnam, but also in the Middle East and even Africa. Mao showed that there is another way of going warfare than the European model. Let's put a European model army. And that had a huge impact, even up till today. And Mao did this by sitting in Yan'an and reading all great military works that got his hands on, not the Sun Tzu, which he found very little use, actually, and declared at some point not to have, he read it at some point, but not until later. But he read Ludendorff, Clausewitz, other people like that, and then had his works translated. Then seminars talking about, so okay, this is the great thing about military stuff. How do we apply this in China in the conditions that we actually face? And he's very different from Clausewitz. Clausewitz wrote a little bit about people's war, let's put it that way, about going amongst the people, as has happened during the Napoleonic Wars with British. But he developed that much further than Clausewitz did. And when you read Mao's own writings, as in Unprotected Warfare, much of it sounds like Clausewitz. But he says, actually, I'm going beyond Clausewitz by creating this, it's a new way of war, by creating this kind of people's liberation war. And that changed. And then, we know it from people like now fighting this kind of, ISIS reads Mao. Of course they do. If you want to wage war, you read the best writers on warfare. And Mao is one of them. And so he is still being read. I think that's 3 questions. You're muted.
Yes, I'm mute now. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for answering all those questions. I think we have to bring this session to a close. And before I ask Rija to, give the vote of thanks, I would just like to say that, we are really privileged to hear some of your research, the outcome of the research of your current project. And we really look forward to seeing the book when it comes out. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And now, Rija, would you like to?
Thank you, ma'am. On behalf of ICS, let me thank our esteemed guest, Professor Hans van Leeuwen, for accepting our invitation to deliver the prestigious VP Dutt Memorial Lecture this year. Thank you for an insightful lecture highlighting the various complex processes surrounding Japan's surrender and for kindly taking up all the questions from our audience. Let me thank our audience on Zoom as well as YouTube for their participation and for asking some interesting questions. I would also like to thank our partners, the India International Center, for joining us today in organizing this prestigious lecture. We are also grateful to the Gargi Dutt VP Dutt Foundation for their valuable support for this event and for many other activities of ICS. I would like to especially thank Ms. Anuradha Dutt, Managing Trustee of the Foundation, for joining us today. Finally, let me thank our research team at ICS, Shruti Jargat, Rangoli Mitra, and KQ Venkaraman for their support in organizing today's lecture. With these words, I conclude my word of thanks. Thank you and have a good evening.